Is entrepreneurship a good path for neurodivergent people? This is something that I get asked a lot, and it has come up in today's questions for Sage by Name, Sage by Name. So today we will be talking about how to make entrepreneurship more accessible. If you're struggling and you are neurodivergent and you're working to be an entrepreneur, then today's topics will be of interest to you. I'm Dr. Becky Sage and I am autistic, and I've also exited a high-tech business. I have a chronic illness which also has been challenging at times, and I spend most of my time now helping other innovative, creative entrepreneurs build their businesses. Sage by Name is my series where I answer questions from you about entrepreneurship, tech, leadership, all those other lovely topics that you want to get stuck into. And normally I tackle 3 to 4 questions per episode, but today we are actually only tackling one because it was a very, very meaty one and I felt like it needed to be broken down into many parts. Don't forget, if you've got any questions, any comments, any stories that you want me to share, just let me know. You can either pop it in the comments or you can head on over to Instagram and DM me if you'd prefer that they were private and anonymous. So let's get stuck into the question. I'm involved in a mentorship business, but I've put my activity on hold due to cognitive regression and communication challenges in my autistic burnout. I can still learn from their podcasts and seminars, but I'm finding it very difficult to translate their trainings around leadership, networking, communication, hustle type stuff into a neuro-affirming / inclusive language. I do find hustle culture to not be neurodivergent friendly, especially since living on 2 spoons a day. Those of you who know. If you're not sure about what 2 spoons a day means, go back to some of my energy budgeting episodes, which I will link to in the comments. The question continues. Would you have any tips or translation methods from Allistic motivation / leadership / business speak to autistic / neurodivergent language? What are your thoughts on that dynamic? I have a lot, hence why we're only gonna tackle this question today. First of all, I wanna say that oh my gosh, I completely get this. And it was something that I didn't notice in the moment when I first started receiving all sorts of different mentorship, training, advice around business. And I was just like, why is this not working? It was very interesting because I could actually theoretically things made sense until you tried to implement things in the real world, and then it was very, very difficult. I also always found that the things that I needed help with seemed to be so different from what other people seemed to need help with. Other people could show up to trainings and hear something that to me actually sounded relatively straightforward as a concept maybe, but when they could then go out there and implement it and everything would be great, and I'd be busy like, how do you actually put this into practice in the real world? And then there were other things where I kind of looked back and realized years later that I totally missed the point. And I think maybe now that I'm in the position of being a mentor, a coach, a trainer, somebody who develops programs for entrepreneurs with inclusion in mind, I look at things a little bit differently, and therefore, I also try to help the founders that I work with to look at things a little bit differently. And honestly, this is really what motivates me to do the work that I do, both in terms of experiences that I had that I found weren't very helpful, but also the people who I worked with that really did help me to break down barriers and see things differently. So all of that has totally informed the way I work now. One thing before I jump into everything else I want to say is I don't think one size fits all advice necessarily works. I think there's frameworks, I think there's theories, I think there's other people's stories that we can tell that can help us to maybe see the path. And I say this to a lot of the entrepreneurs that I work with. You're going to hear lots and lots of different things. Not all of those things are applicable to you and your business. And your job is to, as you say in the question, essentially translate this advice and turn it into something that's going to work for you. You have to take all of the complexity that's coming in, and a lot of that will be noise, and determine how you're going to turn that into focused action. That actually is the job of the entrepreneur. And I try, when I'm doing one-to-one sessions, depending on who I'm working with, we do a lot of work on trying to map that out and look at all of that noise that's coming in and make it clearer. I've often seen that people who've had success in their own businesses might come in and spout, frankly, quite a lot of rubbish. Not all successful business people, but some people will come in, and you see this online a lot actually. I grew to this amount and this is how I did it, blah. And you're like, your context is so different from what other people's context would be. So just because that worked for you at that time, in that moment, in that place, in that sector, does not mean it's going to work for other people. So I guess I'm saying all of this, I know it's not answering that first part of the question, but just to give that context of different things are going to work for different people. And just because someone's saying something with confidence and just because they've had success in their own business does not mean that they necessarily know how to help other people. Some of the best successful entrepreneurs that I talk to are the ones who are humble enough to say, oh yeah, that part there was really lucky on our journey. Sure, we set ourselves up, we worked hard, we were ready to take the opportunity, but actually that was just one of many strategies we were trying out, and it didn't work. Because success in business is a combination of so many different factors, and different people have different versions of success. And if that's not taken into account, then, and it might mean that certain trainings are not the right fit for somebody because success isn't the same for everyone. Actually running a workshop this week on finding what success is, and it's totally different for different founders. So I would say if people are just telling you what to do instead of supporting you through different frameworks, different theories, different exercises to help you draw out what's going to work for your business and your scenario, then I would also be taking any of that advice with a grain of salt. So again, I realize I may be drifting slightly, but that's my headline overview in terms of the answer to this question. But now let's break it down into a series of sub-questions. Okay, you mentioned hustle culture, and so the first question that I've decided to break this down into is hustle culture a requirement for entrepreneurship? First of all, let's talk about what hustle culture even is. So hustle culture is a glorifying of relentless work. It's about this constant productivity. It's about sacrificing personal well-being for career success or business success. It's often about long hours, burning the candle at both ends, and it can often lead to burnout. It's also going to cause a lot of anxiety for different people. I know for me, one of my challenges I have when the workload really ramps up is that anxiety comes along pretty quickly. It's not about being able to deliver the things or show up for the things I need to show up for. What happens is I actually get overexcited, overstimulated, and then that means I burn out all the more quickly. So I do think it's important to recognize that hustle culture is a mindset. It's not actually a strategy. It's a way of thinking about things and glorifying things. And so when we think about, do we need that for entrepreneurship? No, we don't. But do we need sometimes to go over and above? Do we have the business on our mind more often than, say, we were just drawing a salary? I have to tell you, one of the reasons entrepreneurship actually worked really well for me was because whenever I was in paid employment, I would find myself constantly thinking about work, constantly going over and above, always wanting to prove myself, always kind of unable to prove myself. And so I was still burning out. I was still doing all that relentless stuff. And this was pre my first startup. And that was not helpful. And I thought, well, if I'm going to put all this work in, if I'm going to essentially lead myself to burnout, I may as well be doing it on my terms, on something that I care about. So that was the angle that I was coming from originally. Now, of course, I've experienced I'd already experienced burnout at that point, but I hadn't really realized exactly what was going on. And I've experienced burnout since then, more than once. Something that, of course, our neurodivergence plays a part in. And I'll come on to that a little bit later on. So I do think there is something about, does entrepreneurship require hustle culture? I personally don't think it does, but I do think it requires you to be passionate about a certain thing. You need to be aware of opportunities. They may not come in a kind of nice, neat package. I think you can put certain boundaries in place, and then occasionally, if there's a big event or something like that, then you would go to that big event and make the most of it. Still making sure you get enough of the things that are absolute non-negotiables. For me, that would be sleep is really, really important. I think the thing with hustle culture that is particularly unhelpful is this equating worth with busyness. And actually, in a business, those two things are not the same thing. So first of all, busyness is not equal to business success. In fact, I think I was talking about this on the last video, where sometimes you can fill all your days, you can be incredibly busy, and you're not even moving towards your goals. You're not actually feeling that satisfaction from any type of achievement. So definitely decoupling the idea of busyness and achievement are the same thing. That's not to say that certain aspects of work aren't required. I think the mindset of glorifying relentless work is something that is so embedded in all of working life. And I definitely see it everywhere I go. And it's something that I really have to catch myself. So inside my own brain, I have to, because I'll look on other people and I'll see them being like, oh yeah, this week I've got to go up to Glasgow for a meeting, then I'm going to London for a meeting, and I've got this dinner and that dinner and blah, blah, blah. And I will see that and go, oh, I wish I could do that. I wish I could be that busy. I wish I had that stamina. I wish that I could spend that much time with people and not be completely burnt out after it. And then I have to catch myself and go, that's not your way. That's not going to be the way that you find your success. So I have had to catch that mindset. But then counter to that, one thing I do want to say is, of course, we've all heard of the 80-20 rule, where 20% of what we do will lead to our success, but we don't actually know which part will pay off. And I think that's one of the reasons why we hear a lot about hustle culture and entrepreneurship, because you have to do a lot of things, stimulating a lot of activity, meeting a lot of people in order to find that one piece of that one diamond that's out there that's going to really help you unlock your business. And that's challenging. And so I think that's where a lot of the hustle culture comes into entrepreneurship, because you have to do an awful lot of work in order to find those really key people. So the question is, can you reduce that a little bit by being strategic, by being smart? So one thing that I think is also important to mention right now is motivation relies on small wins. And I was really interested the other day when I was talking to a group of entrepreneurs. They were talking about kind of what constitutes highs and lows. And I thought it was really interesting that we essentially came up with the fact that when they feel like there is momentum, that's when they feel like they're more at a high. And then when they feel like there is no momentum, that's when they feel like they're at a low. And so I think that we also just have these personal internal things where we want to be continuing to try and push that momentum. And of course, again, that kind of hustle culture mindset mentality tells us we keep moving, then it keeps moving, then we feel good about it. And actually, so the question might be to ask yourself, how do I continue to increase momentum without just scattergunning busyness? And as an entrepreneur, sometimes you can go quite a long time without getting any breakthroughs. And so I think that that's another question, is like, how are you going to create those moments of achievement? How are you going to break down what you're doing into those smaller steps? And then it's not about hustle culture per se, it's about doing mindful activity. Sacrificing things for your career is very normal, and certainly normal in a business context. On the Founded and Grounded podcast, one thing we ask every single person is, what have you had to sacrifice? And I don't think there's anyone yet who hasn't said something. They don't always see it as a sacrifice though, and that's maybe what I'd like to invite you to do as well at this point, which is to say that for those who have had that success, it's been about a focus. So a prioritization on building that business. And that means that there are other things that have to be sacrificed. Now, being neurodivergent means that well-being is harder to come by, and purely living, especially with not many spoons, out in the world and out, especially in these contexts of maybe events, pictures, being around people, being around team, constant thinking, it can be incredibly draining. And so for me, the things that have worked have been to understand myself. And then just to the point about time, are long hours required for entrepreneurship? Well, it's not one size fits all. And some people can build businesses in a short period of time, or putting in a small amount of time every week or whatever. But especially when you're getting a business going, you're starting from scratch and you're having to build everything as you go. So there are times when long hours are going to be needed. Again, this might be more about how do you spend your time in a way where you're putting your energy into those really focused activities so that you can start to build up that momentum that you need. But of course, that's very dependent on business and business goals. And then what you want to do is, once you kind of know what your strategy is going to be, once you know what's going to be getting your business moving forward, where that product market fit is, what the customers need, etc., then you can start building in processes, structures that are going to help to take some of that load off. So is hustle culture required for entrepreneurship? No, but only if you see it as that mindset. You need to shift the mindset. That doesn't mean that there aren't components of having to sacrifice, having to work longer hours. Now I'm going to move on to the next section, and I appreciate that I haven't fully answered the end question yet, which I will do at the end of this video. It's because I'm building up each of these parts to get to that answer. Okay, so if you are an entrepreneur and you have no spoons, or you have very few spoons, what can you do? So this is definitely a challenge, and for me, one thing I've experienced both with chronic illness and with my autism is that I suddenly might get left with no spoons at all, and it can be very challenging because you don't know how long that's going to go on for. You don't know necessarily which activities are going to make things worse or better, although I guess over time you get to know that more about yourself. So it definitely can be very challenging when you find yourself with no spoons. And I've developed a few strategies that have helped me with it. First of all, prioritize like your life depends on it, because it kind of does. And that includes if you're getting additional learning, mentoring, even things like therapy. That takes energy, and sometimes you actually do need to say, no, I'm gonna strip it or right back and just choose that one thing I'm gonna do today. And I appreciate there's days when you can't even do that one thing, but if you've got 2 spoons, what's that thing you're gonna do? And the person who asked this question, it sounds like you've already done that. So hopefully by stepping back a little bit, you are in a position where you're able to ride out this particular burnout or whatever it is that you're experiencing, this low spoon era, and continuing to prioritize. It's so important to understand what's going to use up those precious spoons that you have, and to try and eradicate that just for a short time. I understand that there's always a challenge of getting the balance right as well with things like exercise, for example. So I know for me, exercise can really amplify my energy, but if I've got no spoons, then exercise can also take up that only energy that I've got. If I know that some form of exercise does actually help, then I might do a small amount of exercise, maybe just to get my body moving, and then focus on that one business task that I was going to do in that particular day. Where possible, start delegating, and I know that's not always possible, especially in the early days of entrepreneurship. And I know it's so frustrating because when we need the most help, we basically have the least help. And also, in those early stages of the business, this is when there are the most unknowns. It's much harder to even automate. So there's so many things that make it a really, really big mountain to climb. And one of, I hear a lot, and you've probably heard this too, if it was easy, everyone would be doing it. And that's not to say you shouldn't be doing it. That is to say, when things are a little bit harder or you don't have that energy, it is going to feel hard. It's going to feel like there's quite a big mountain to climb. And I think just having that acceptance and knowing that just by that courageous step to say, I am going to go after building this business. I'm going to do this thing that takes up energy, that takes up time, that takes sacrifice. And I am going to put myself in that position. It's a bold move, and there are aspects of being neurodivergent that make that harder, and there are aspects that actually might mean you are the best person to do this. There is a timing thing here, and it may be, and I think this is where the hustle culture comes in a lot actually with entrepreneurship. One thing that I have done is to accept that there are times when I can really push and there are times when I can't, and I need to step back or I need to step away. We hear so much in the business world about you need to move quickly. If you don't move quickly, then you miss out on this opportunity and that opportunity. If you can't move quickly, you can't move quickly. And sure, there might be aspects of the market right now that mean that this is a good time for this particular business opportunity. But there will also be things in the future that mean that it's a right time for maybe a slightly different business opportunity. And so I think I certainly have had to go through that acceptance of maybe right now isn't the time for the higher paced work. One of the things that I have found very challenging, but also that can be helpful when you've got no spoons, is adjusting your goals. Again, this comes back to really those prioritization steps. One of the things I found hard about this is because if I adjust my goals too much, then I get quite demotivated, and then those goals don't really become useful goals at all because I don't really care about meeting them because I've already adjusted them so much. So it actually might be better just to accept this is a low growth phase, it's a low energy phase, and I'm going to take my time. I'm going to make sure that I'm doing the things that give me energy. I'm going to make sure that I'm keeping the energy usage down. So let's move on to talking about what is Allistic, business, or motivational speak. So it's quite interesting here because it probably means different things to different people. For anyone who's watching who doesn't know, Allistic means like anyone who's not neurodivergent. So I actually think that this is potentially an unfair characteristic of what it is, of Allistic people and the way they speak, because actually, for me, what this really comes down to is whether or not people are good communicators. And I also think some of this plays into stereotypes of autistic people as well. So I know that for me, I don't experience problems from all of these things that I'm about to say. And I'd be really interested to know from individuals who are watching, what are the things you actually find challenging when it comes to Allistic speech? Because I'm going to think it's going to be quite different for a lot of people. So certain things that come out of different reports, which I will link in the description, is a use of jargon, of buzzwords, of, I've heard it said that there's some valuing vagueness, and which can be very helpful for some people, because vagueness means that it's painting this general picture. It allows people to connect at one level, even if they might not resonate on a deeper level perhaps, but it may not be very useful for neurodivergent people. Do you know what was interesting when I started to research this was I realized so much of this goes beyond just communication with language. It goes to how we deliver that language. So things like reliance on non-verbal cues, which some autistic people will be struggling with. And that also plays into things like sarcasm and really reading how somebody's delivering turns of phrase. There's also indirectness and friendly talk and not getting to the point. Maybe you'd say, you could argue I've done that in this video. One of the things that I think is quite unhelpful is a focus on social hierarchy, on unwritten rules, of saying or doing things just because we say or do that's what we meant to say or do. And I wonder if that played into this question a little bit of, there might be, if Allistic people are talking about hustle culture and entrepreneurship, there might be a sense of, oh, well, this is just what's done. This is just what we do in order to build a business. And there's these assumptions that are made, which actually we might want to challenge those assumptions. Often there might be implicit expectations that haven't been spelled out explicitly. I think that probably is something that I did have a bit of a challenge with, but I also think what's actually going on a lot of the time is more to do with this vagueness. I think that often as an autistic person, you think that somebody might have been trying to say something. You might be thinking this is Allistic communication, there is some implicit expectations built in, when actually that person doesn't really understand the full picture. And so there isn't actually any implicit expectations, but you're still sat there going like, hang on a second, I don't understand what it is I'm meant to be doing with this information. How does this actually help me? And so sometimes it can be very simple, actually contextualizing what's being said or being clearer about instructions that are being given. And I think a lot of this is about how things are delivered. So I'm always, when I design sessions, I like to design them in a way that takes somebody on a journey. So often I'm going to do some contextualizing, but then most of what I'm going to be doing with those people is a series of exercises whereby they have to do the thinking, and then I'm going to guide them along that way. When it comes to some of that will be about explaining frameworks that can work quite well, and some of that will be about drawing things out. I guess I've worked with enough neurodivergent people and Allistic people at this point to know the types of questions that are going to come up. And so, for example, I do an exercise called the high-low exercise. And I say, plot your journey, and it might be over the course of your lifetime or over the course of the last year. And I say, I want you to look back over your journey and go through the highs and the lows. And now I always very explicitly say, I'm purposefully not going to explain to you what high and low means in this context, because part of this exercise is about trying to understand what high and low means to you. And so that's the type of thing that I think can be very useful. And again, it's about being explicit. But it's not about being explicit with an answer, it's about being explicit with an instruction so that somebody can go on their own mental journey. So all of those things I listed just now, so use of jargon, reliance on nonverbal cues, indirectness, focus on social hierarchies and unwritten rules, implicit expectations, all of those things, to me, if anyone's doing all of that, that's actually just bad communication. Like, I don't think that's got anything to do with like being neurodivergent or not being neurodivergent. I honestly think that is to do with people not communicating /mentoring /training well. And I think what happens is, as a neurodivergent person, because you've got so much stacked up against you already, and you're probably, like, energy-wise, you're processing so much more when you're in these environments, your expectations are that there is good communication going on, when actually all of these things are unhelpful if done depending on how they're done. And so I think actually what is potentially happening, and where you might be able to let yourself off the hook a little bit more as a neurodivergent person, or ease some of the energy that is taken up in these sessions, is to think, first of all, am I taking all of this in earnest? Which is definitely something I do, where I'm like, yeah, I'm taking this person really seriously, and yet actually they're throwing around a bunch of illogical BS. And that does happen. In that particular case, it's about saying what's useful for me, what's useful for my business right now. And I should say, like, I'm saying this in response to the question. I'm lucky that I work with lots of incredibly talented and experienced people. And when I talk about some of these things, I'm not necessarily talking about things that I have experienced with the people I work with and have worked with over the past years, but they are things that I have seen. I think that it can also be challenging to deal with unspoken cultural norms, and that shows up a lot across entrepreneurship. We just had that conversation about hustle culture. I mean, a big one that comes up for me is the norm of just get out there and meet people. If I just go to networking events, all I'm going to do is drain my energy. I'm probably not going to meet anyone. Certainly in my first business and where I was then, it was not very helpful. I have to be on a stage, I have to be on a video, I have to meet people in a way where I am presenting to the room and then they come back and meet me. It's like, I guess, an inbound strategy rather than outbound strategy, which again, those might be buzzwords. And inbound being people coming to you because they've seen you somewhere and you've put yourself in a position on platforms where they see you. Outbound being that you have to go out and reach out and find those people. Outbound has worked slightly better for me as I've become more experienced, as I've got more confidence, as maybe I've got more just everything under my belt. And the thing that makes it the easiest is to have very, very specific goals in mind. I like giving myself little tasks, my own little challenges I'm going to do for myself if I do go to a networking event. So it sort of gives me an activity to focus on versus just the overwhelm of being in that room. And then I think the other thing that is possibly going on in this particular situation is a mismatch between your goals as an entrepreneur, your version of success, and those of a program. And again, maybe not in this exact situation, I don't want to label that in any way, but it can be very easy to just think, oh, all of this stuff that these people are saying is what I need to be listening to. It's what I need to make my business a success, to hit my goals. And the reality is that they are building something that is for a certain set of goals, but those goals might not be the exact same fit to you. So I think it's really important to have a really strong understanding of what your goals are, what your circumstances, what your context is, and recognize that often people will not be talking with all of those things in mind. It's definitely one of the values of getting to have one-to-one support, and that's what I get to do in my entrepreneur in residence roles. And so you get to know people, you get to know what they need. I don't have enough time with them, frankly, or I don't have enough time in general to really nurture, but I do get to know the people I work with pretty well. So you understand their needs, their point of view, their context. It's one of the very first things I always ask entrepreneurs is about that. What's your current situation? So if you haven't been asked that, if a program hasn't been designed with that in mind, then it may not be the most helpful to you. So finally, sorry, I've taken a while to get here. Would I have any tips on translation methods from Allistic to Neurodivergent speak? So there is one big thing I've done to completely shift the way I think about what other people are saying. And that is to see everything as data points. And I guess I have a scientific background, and so I'm also, when I think about those data points, thinking how valid is that data point? So I'm going to critique it. So the more you think like that, the better. And that's not to say that if you critique it, it's not about disrespecting what somebody said, what their experience is, what their lessons are, because they could be incredibly valuable, they could be great teachers, they could be great trainers, mentors. But I might turn around and say, yes, that's great. Does that apply to my context or my current challenge? So those data points I might kind of lower down the rankings, down the weighting compared to other things that I'm going to do, I'm going to research. So that's the first thing to say, is that the things probably aren't going to be very helpful if you just take them at face value. It's about filtering it. If you've only got 2 spoons, that's hard. And so I think it's really important to make sure that you're giving yourself enough space for development. And it might not always be exactly the right time for that. Very simple things can be really helpful in terms of taking in information and then figuring out what's the most useful information for you. So I like to use big pieces of paper. It's the only thing that seems to be able to create enough space in my mind. And I like to map out all of the different things that are going on, what I'm thinking about, what I've been told, how do these things all mesh together? And then can I create some kind of sense out of it? I think this helps when it comes to if you're being told a lot of buzzwords, for example, if you're taking a lot of things very literally, or if you're taking things from a different context and trying to apply them to your business and it doesn't really make sense, you can start to see all of that. But I also think it helps in terms of giving you back your own agency, because as an entrepreneur, it is ultimately about the path you are choosing to take and the decisions you are choosing to make. And so it's about bringing in all that information and essentially thinking of that as sort of a divergent thinking phase. And then you've got to pull out the key messages that are most important to you and use that to then build your path forward. You will notice I actually do use a lot of metaphors, a lot of probably some buzzwords, some jargon, and that's partly because I also mirror a lot. So one of the things I'm doing all the time is taking in what people are saying and then making that make sense to me. And I will then maybe repeat that back, which I appreciate may not always be very helpful. Hopefully, because I'm filtering it through my lens and my way of understanding certain things, then that might be helpful to other people who think differently. So that again plays back to this thing of my main tip is creating space. Because if you don't create space, and I mean that in terms of having enough time, having enough mental space, mental bandwidth to work through things, otherwise you're going to get stressed, you're going to burn out more quickly. And so making sure that you have that time to reflect on what's being said, looking things up, Googling what people are saying. What does somebody mean when they say X, Y, or Z? These are all things that I have done. It's very normal as an autistic person to see everything, to get overstimulated. So if people start talking about something, we're seeing this whole system. And this system is many, many different interconnecting pieces. And one of the things I found really hard would be when people would they'd make some statement or talk about something in mentorship and they'd be like, so just do this here. And then but in my head, I'm like, but just doing this changes this whole system of stuff. And it was never as simple as just change this. And I do think ways of thinking really plays into this conversation. Some people are very sequential in their thinking, and that just do this is something they are able to do, and then they move on with it and they'll deal with the consequences down the road. And those consequences may or may not ever play out. I'm much more of a global thinker, a bigger picture thinker, and so I kind of always see that big picture, and I'm a systems thinker. So for me, I really struggle with anything that's just take this one next step. It can be very stifling and it just feels very wrong, very uncomfortable. But sometimes you do need to just take those steps. And so again, this is sort of a real balance that is at play. And that's why for me, these big picture, writing things down on big pieces of paper is really helpful. And also being aware of where your own mind is at a particular point in time, because you might already be hyper focused on one aspect of the business, and what they're trying to talk to you about is outside of that hyper focus area. So that might feel like it's quite a struggle to land as well. So then again, it's about creating the space to be able to go and listen, to engage when talking about different areas of the business. I have been known to put other people on a pedestal, especially if they're in that kind of role of a trainer or a mentor or a coach, and buy into absolutely everything they say, and then down the line realize it doesn't make sense. So I think that comes back to my idea of taking these things as data points, and they might be well respected data points, validated data points. And it's incredibly useful to learn what might be thought of as best practice, but also recognize that this may not work for you. And hopefully if you can build up a good rapport with the person you're working with, you can say, actually, this isn't working for me right now. And then I think another thing that's really useful to be aware of is, where do your current challenges actually lie? Because you might be working with mentorship, training, podcasts, everything else, and they're tackling one particular challenge, but actually that's not where your challenges are. And I know for me, and I think it probably sounds like this for you as well, energy is my biggest challenge. It's always my biggest challenge, trying to balance those spoons and continually trying to stay in alignment with my work as I balance those spoons, because I know that being in alignment is the thing that gives me the most energy and keeps my momentum going the best. And so knowing that actually your biggest challenge isn't what theory should you be applying, it isn't figuring out what the strategy is. It might be, how do I put this in practice as an entrepreneur with 2 spoons? So then your questions become something that is different, and different people will be more equipped to answer those questions. And I have to be honest, sometimes I kind of like just the woo-woo motivational talk, because it can get me out of my own head. And I think that being in my own head can sometimes be something that is unhelpful, actually, and slows me down. So I do think my kind of biggest tip with all of this is, well, make sure it's the right time to be doing development, doing learning, being involved with this type of thing, and giving yourself enough space to do that, but also recognizing that your challenges might be different from other people's challenges, and being really clear about what your current challenges are. Although great mentors will often see right through those things, or dig even deeper, and might make you realize that what you think are your challenges are not actually the challenges. But being open about that, I think, can be really helpful with the right people, and not everyone's going to understand it. But we've got to remember, a lot of entrepreneurs are neurodivergent, and lots of different types of neurodivergent, and I certainly have met more, well, I don't know anymore actually, but there was a time when I definitely had met more ADHD entrepreneurs than autistic entrepreneurs. I've met quite a few ADHD entrepreneurs now, and so I think that different people have different needs at different times. And so just that kind of checkbox of the Allistic speak, what doesn't really work, the reality is what doesn't really work is poor communication and people just talking rubbish and talking jargony. So the final thing I want to reflect on is this idea of, is it me or is it them? And in this book, Maureen Dunn's The Neurodiversity Edge, which is the essential guide to embracing autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and other neurological differences for any organization. And of course, as an entrepreneur, you might be working on your own, you might not be in an organization per se, but I think this is relevant to the scenarios that you're talking about. She talks about the double empathy problem, which is essentially that all people struggle to understand people who think differently from them. So it's not a neurodivergent Allistic problem. It's actually the fact that all people, if they're going through something different, or if they haven't been through what that person's gone through, they're going to find it hard to come halfway and bring you what you need. One thing I really like about this question is that it asks kind of, what can I do? What can I do as a neurodivergent person to more easily translate what other people are saying? But I as I was going through this, as I was answering these questions, as I was thinking about it, really all I could think about was with my own hat on as somebody who's a trainer and who mentors. And I just kept thinking, well, people need to be meeting you halfway too. When you design a program to support people, you don't know who the individuals are who are going to be coming on that program, what their backgrounds are, the way they think, their perspectives, their challenges, and most of the time in entrepreneurship, the challenges, things like your actual business strategy and how to get money and all of that kind of stuff is pretty well documented. You can find the answers to those questions. The real crux of the challenge is, how do I as an entrepreneur go on this journey? So all programs that are supporting entrepreneurs really need to have at least some layer that delves into that. We always talk about a founders first approach because the founders are the people who are driving businesses. So I'm going to go back to one thing that I said earlier, which is I do think that if you're on a program and you're struggling to translate what's being said, I would be questioning whether that communication is good or not. And I'm not sure I would call it Allistic and neurodivergent communication, unless there's some things I haven't picked up on here and you can let me know about that. I would call it good and bad communication, and perhaps that's harsh, I don't know, perhaps that's controversial. But there are definitely things that can be done when designing programs to make sure that it really helps the people to develop rather than just giving them information. We always used to talk about, when I was running an ed tech company, we would talk about this idea that education isn't just about a teacher giving a pill, a knowledge pill, to a student, because it's not. That's not what education is. Education is enabling that person to develop. And some of that is about giving them useful knowledge to contextualize certain things, and then you need to guide them to help develop skills. Entrepreneurship is such a practical thing that is what should be happening every time you go through any kind of development or training. So much of this is about creating an environment where people are comfortable and can easily come to you and say, oh, what did you mean by that? Or put their hand up. Oh, sorry, you use this acronym. What does that mean? Or you use this term. Can you tell me what it means? So a lot of it is about creating environments where people can thrive. I actually love metaphors and storytelling when I'm training, and if there's neurodivergent people listening and you're like, I hate it, do tell me, because the reason I love it is because I guess I've always used stories as a way to make sense of the world, and it helps me with my empathy. I'm a massive reader, and more so when I was growing up, less so now. We have all of the other distractions in life, but I do find stories very helpful, and I'm very broad when I talk about stories and a lot of different things. For me, a story is about taking somebody on a journey to help them understand something, and so I do sometimes use stories. I don't really have an imagination. It's a whole other topic that we could talk about. My creativity works in slightly different ways, so I don't find it easy necessarily to come up with a metaphor. But if I've heard one that I like and that I think works, then I might use that when I'm teaching. A couple of other things to consider. Different media of communication. I think different aspects of teaching lend themselves to different media really well. And as I mentioned before, if I'm actually working face-to-face, especially with a group of people, then I'm going to be using exercises. I'm going to be drawing things out of people and allowing you to experience things that are going to help you, and setting it up in that way. But you do need to make people feel safe and like they're in safe hands when you do that. So you need good facilitators to do that kind of thing. When it comes to other aspects, I think for neurodivergent people, asynchronous can work really, really well. So if we have to learn in real time, there might be so much overstimulation going on that it's then really hard to actually take on board what's being said. So asynchronous learning can be very, very helpful. So not in real time, maybe video content, for example. And that can help with giving processing time. A long stream of verbal instructions is something that is often cited as not being very helpful for neurodivergent people, and but I don't think it's very helpful for any people. And so if I would avoid that. But if there is a long stream of verbal instructions and I was receiving that long stream of verbal instructions, I'd be writing them down one step at a time. And then the final thing to say is, one of the things I think is really useful when it comes to being involved in business mentoring and coaching is the peer group relationships that get built. But those relationships do not get built in small talk. They get built, again, through good facilitation. So what are you doing to bring those people together and allow them to actually create, learn, grow, solve business challenges together, all of those things? That is how a community gets formed. So those are all the things that I like to think about as I'm trying to work with entrepreneurs. So as I said, this was kind of a long, winding question, and I feel like there's still so much I could probably say on this topic. But my main tips are, make sure it's the right time to do it. Make sure you've got enough space, time, mental space to get involved with any type of mentorship, coaching. Recognize that it's not one size fits all, and not every single opportunity might be the right one for you. And people might have a different set of goals than the goals that you've got. And as you're building your business, as you're moving forward and developing yourself as a leader around networking, communication, and everything else, recognize that it's important to start where you are. I hope all of those thoughts were helpful for you. Thank you for asking the question. If you are also somebody who experiences these type of things, please let me know. And if there are any specific examples, please let me know in the comments, and then I can speak to those things even more specifically. Have a really great day. That's the end of today's Sage by Name, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye. Sage by name, sage by name.